So I apologize for the technical issue that the audience was able to see. So I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Summer Jones, and I'm a trustee for South Orange Village. I was elected in 2019. I want to thank everyone for attending the start of many discussions around the Black community in South Orange. When I came to South Orange for college, I went to Seton Hall. I have to admit, I did not come into town very often. We would take the 31 and we would head up to the train station and head into the city. However, when I went to go look for a home, I wanted to actually make sure I was in a town that I thought was as diverse as the town that I grew up in. And I had a friend that lived in town, and I would come and visit and I would see everyone and I would be amazed. And so I moved to town in 2015 and back to South Orange in 2015. And from there, I met a lot of amazing, amazing people. And I've heard so many stories of the community, the Black community in South Orange. I'm also a liaison for the Historic Preservation Commission. And I was reading through the two books that are that were made for South Orange, called South Orange and then South Orange Revisited. And the books are very, very informative. But what I found was missing was the history of the Black community. And I know that there is a really rich history here. And just going to Seton Hall as a student in the late 90s, as well as being a trustee now, I wanted to make sure that we are actually, that the Black community is actually represented. And so I did I spoke to Reverend Richardson and I spoke to Seton Hall. I was attending the Seton Hall Black History Month event. And the idea of actually creating an oral history about South Orange and Black people in South Orange was very, very important to me. And so I do want to thank, before I introduce the panelists and moderator, I wanted to thank Dr. Shauna Cooper Gibson, who was very, very instrumental in allowing me to attend the meetings and to sit down with the team and really discuss it. So I am going to introduce the panel and our moderator. So our moderator is Dr. Kelly Harris, who is the chair of Africana Studies at Seton Hall University. Reverend Forrest Pritchett from Seton Hall University. He is a senior advisor to the provost for diversity, equity, and inclusion. He is also the program director at the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Program. Reverend Dr. Terry Richardson from First Baptist Church of South Orange. Dr. Adene Slackman Anderson, she is actually representing 5 generations in South Orange. Reverend Estelle Werner David, who was actually one of the first Black families on Stanley Road. She's also representing the Civic Association. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Harris.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and Summer, thank you for such a wonderful program. And it is my honor to be the moderator. But you don't want to hear me, we want to hear what our panelists have to say. So let's go on and get into the discussion. And we want to start by just getting brief reflections from each of you about Black history in South Orange. Just a brief introductory history. And now let's see, I'll start from my left, what I see on my screen. Dr. Richardson, could you start us off, please? Reverend Dr. Richardson.
Terry is fine. First of all, it's an honor being here. So my impressions is I am elated and excited that South Orange would take this initiative. I was speaking to Trustee Summer and just simply congratulating her for just having not just the thought of mind, but also taking it upon herself to ask these questions and to form this collaboration. So it's really, it's good to see this birth and come to pass so we can document the contributions as well as to history and the footprints of people in Black people in South Orange.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson.
Okay, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, and happy Black History Month. I know that Black history making is 365 days, 24/7, but I also think that it's very important that we take this month to pay special attention to all the contributions. And so like Reverend Richardson, I too am delighted to be a part of this austere group and to share the platform with my fellow panelists. So growing up in South Orange, from my perspective, was idyllic. And I am often amazed when people talk about the Black presence in South Orange, because as far as I'm concerned, through my lived experiences, there has always been that Black presence here in South Orange. And so having this opportunity to collaborate with Seton Hall, with the Township, and with First Baptist is very special. One of the things I will say that I remember as a child is that South Orange was truly a village. It was a village, very provincial. You had your hobby shop, you had the local hardware store. There was community access and opportunity. And I know that my childhood here in South Orange was idyllic because I came from a very strong family. And when I say strong family, I'm not only talking about my immediate family, where my parents instilled in us a high sense of self-esteem. There wasn't anything that we could not do. And so we took full advantage of what South Orange offered then. But I'm also talking about the extended family, because a very prominent part of growing up when I grew up in South Orange was First Baptist Church. And First Baptist Church always had the reputation of being the single Black institution in town, that and the Elks Club. And between those two worlds, I had what I call an idyllic childhood. It was very balanced, it was very integrated, it was very socially responsible, and it was very empowering. So I'll leave it with that and then just let the other questions answer some
Thank
more.
you. Reverend David, let's have your initial thought.
My family moved to South Orange in 1963. So I have seen changes, and I think South Orange has made some progress and still needs to make more. I didn't have an idyllic childhood in South Orange, but my children went to school here, and I can see the changes in the generations in terms of their embracing of each other in friendship, because my children, some of my children are still friends with people who they went to elementary school with, which I'm always amazed. So I think South Orange is on the move. It still has a lot of glitches it needs to address.
Okay, thank you very much. And Reverend Dr. Pritchett.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. I greet everybody on behalf of Seton Hall University and all of us who labor here in this vineyard. I started at Seton Hall in 1978, but a number of years earlier, 1967, when I was a graduate student at the New School for Social Research, working on a doctorate in sociology at that point in time, and preparing to get married. My fiance and I had reserved one weekend in which we were going to go looking for apartments in Essex County. So we started off in the morning in East Orange and Newark looking, and we planned on doing a kind of a circle that would bring us into the South Orange area, where we planned on having lunch before but we weren't going to be looking for any apartments, because our gut level instinct about South Orange in those days was that we probably would not be finding anything. But then also, as we got closer to South Orange in our car, it started going through our mind about how would we even be received having lunch here. So I just share that as my my opener. Yeah, that was in May of 1967. I might add 4 weeks later, we were married and settled on an apartment in West Orange. But 4 weeks after we were married, on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, 4 weeks later on a Sunday, the Newark Rebellion began in July. So I just put that in as my point of reference for this discussion.
Thank you very much. I want to ask one more general question to the panel. Everybody doesn't have to answer, But I do want to start with Dr. Anderson on this particular question. In the 1930 census, 30 Black people owned homes throughout the community, including on Meeker Street, Meadow Place, Academy Street, Church Street, and First Street. Why do you think there was such an issue with an influx of movers buying homes in the area?
Okay, so let me just give a little context here, because I love the fact that you began with the census, because we all have just come from under the census 2020, and we really encouraged everyone to complete the census. But we all know that the census, which started in 1790, really has a rather controversial and history attached to it, because it was used as a political tool. And primarily, it was used to maintain the caste system and to really identify those with the one-drop rule, so that they could continue to deny many of the social, economic, and legal privileges that were reserved for white people and denied to Black people. And I begin with that because you mentioned and referenced the census in the 1930s. And I know for a fact that between 1850 and the 1930s and 1940s, Black codes and Jim Crow laws were very, very prevalent, and they were propagated, through the identification of the census. So I just had to put that out there because I have not read about the 1930s and 1940s census here in South Orange. So I'll take your word for it. But I'm reminded that the hunter, certainly tells a different story from the lion. And I know that there has always been a very strong presence of Black people in South Orange. If we look at First Baptist Church, it's celebrating 125 years. It started in 1895. My grandmother was born in 1896. She came here when she was 12 with her father. So that gives you a sense of the early 1900 history that my family has here. And even though I was not around, believe it or not, for the 1940s census, a lot of those issues that I brought up, prevailed. But it was a time when there has always, from my lived experience, there has always been that strong presence of Blacks in this community. Those are very formative years. You had many Jews moving from Newark into South Orange. You had many Black businesses, that started. Here we had a major depression in the 1920s, and I know that my grandfather and so many others had a lucrative, limousine service and other businesses in the 1920s, around the same time that ShopRite was opening in South Orange, that Town Hall was opening up in South Orange. And so from that standpoint, I saw, the connections between business owners through the tales that were told to me. But it's true, due to the caste system in this society, and I think South Orange is probably just a microcosm of what was going on across the land, Blacks have always been relegated, to a certain area. And so while some people may think that they were limited to Meeker Street or Second Street or First Street, those streets were a source of pride for many of us. But it was because of that restriction that many people, like my father, like my aunt, Dorothy Pons, who, by the way, is quite upset that she's not on the panel today. She's 101 years old. But she was one of the founding members of the Fair Housing Association, which began looking into the very point that I think that you're raising regarding the relegation of Blacks to certain streets, et cetera. I think that in those days, Blacks were glad to buy where they bought. We like being around people who like us and who look like us. And so from our perspective, living on Second or First or Meeker Street was really quite exciting. But from a legal and political perspective, many Blacks realized and knew that we needed to expand that. And that was happening across the country with civil rights, et cetera. And so they started the Fair Housing Association. My father, Dorothy Pons, the Baileys, et cetera. and they began to have some white allies. And in talking with Dorothy Pons today, for example, and again, she's 101, she was telling me about the times that they would go and actually try to buy houses that were for sale in other parts of South Orange, would be denied. And then some of their allied members of the fair housing, whites, would go and they would be accepted to try to really buy and purchase those homes. So yeah, I'll leave it with that, but just I wanted to plant the seed and give it a little perspective.
Thank you. I'm gonna let other people tackle that if they want to, but keep this in mind. I want to come back to you because one of the things I'm interested in, and I hope everybody else is interested in, where did your people migrate from? So we all migrated from somewhere, and the migration patterns are very interesting. And two, and think about the vibrancy of Black life in South Orange, because one of the things that is very interesting when we look at Black communities, people always think about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, but we had a lot of mini Black Wall Streets, a lot of areas where Black people had businesses and were thriving and doing things. So let's go to Reverend David to address that first question.
Okay, I'm having technical difficulties, but I can address it verbally.
Okay.
My family moved from East Orange, which I spent like 8 years of education there, but we originally came from Mississippi. But you know, my journey was bi-coastal. My father, who was a doctor, was completing his medical training. So we lived in New Jersey, New York, California, and my mother's mother was sick in Mississippi. So I've had quite a journey. We could be considered a part of that migration from the South because my father was committed not to raise his children in a Jim Crow South.
Okay, thank you. Reverend Richardson, I know you said call you Terry, but I can't do that. I got to call you Reverend Richardson. So forgive me. Go ahead, Reverend.
That's okay, Dr. Harris. So I want to reiterate, and I just want to echo on something that Dr. Slackman Anderson mentioned. And so when we really talk about this issue with the, I believe it was the 1930s census, so it does paint a picture and it shows a picture. But after 24 years of being the pastor of First Baptist Church, I also want to paint a context. I came in 1997, and First Baptist has a rich history, but First Baptist was that, as Adeni, as Dr. Slackman Anderson.
Adeni's fine.
It was one of two critical institutions that were so vitally important for the Black population. Now, over 24 years, I've heard wonderful verbal stories outside of the little information that's actually been documented by the South Orange Library or any other newspaper source. There's a rich verbal history that has not been recorded about the people of color in South Orange, as well as their contribution to the South Orange community that helps make the community really what it is today. And so that's why this platform is so critically important for us to share some of those oral histories and at the same time document it so we can really educate the current as well as future and residents here in South Orange. But you do have your stories that how First Baptist was the gymnasium, it was the situation room, it was everything to people of color. Even some of that oral history really documents or shares, if you will, the stories of how the first people of color actually became residents. They started as domestic workers that would come into South Orange, work for the residents, and then have to leave by dark before it became dark because they were not allowed to be actually seen in South Orange after dark. And it wasn't until, at least from an oral history perspective, it wasn't until someone came with the idea, hey, let's allow our domestic workers to live within South Orange as opposed to coming in and then having to leave and then come back the next day. And so some of the streets that we named, or some of the geographical areas that we've already named, like 2nd Street, Church Street, and so on, that was the designated area that the first people of color were allowed to live in South Orange. Fast forwarding it just a little, hence that became the location of the First Baptist Church of South Orange. And that was so critical to social, economic, religious life of Black residents. So I'll just keep it there for now. But again, as Adenise, I just wanted to put that perspective of an oral history that hasn't really been captured until now.
Thank you, and that's very important. Reverend Dr. Pritchett.
Sir, what can I do for you?
Do you want to tackle that first question?
On
Black people owning homes in South Orange community?
well, I can tackle it only from the perspective of the lens of what I was exposed to, if it's appropriate. I'm going to go into the 1980s only in that, as someone trained in sociology, I thought, in a sense, I had an idea of what race relations were like. But in the 1980s, there was a series of occurrences that happened in which the homes, upper middle class type homes, were being graffitiized or attacked by some local racists. And the homes were being spray painted with slogans like "niggers go home." So once again, that was my first exposure to anything like that. But I turned all of that into case studies that I had my students looking at, and my perspective for the students were that all of them as students are looking forward to experiencing some degree of social mobility. I said, so we all have a general understanding of what it may be like to live in urban environments, but even if you're choosing to live in upper middle class communities, understand that the realities of the 20th century America can follow people. And I might add that that series of graffiti attacks, initially, my understanding as an outsider was that there was literally perhaps no real community follow through. Nothing actually happened. It was reported to the police. And then maybe a few weeks later, it happened to another home. And then very little happened except the Star Ledger picked it up by the second time it happened. And the third time this happened, I'll say within a period maybe of 5 to 6 weeks. At that point, it hit the New York City Regional News Network. So this story went national at that point. Then I believe at that point, I remember groups coming together because they were probably embarrassed that indeed what little dirty laundry may have existed in South Orange and Maplewood was now hanging out. And for many people, this did not represent the image that they wanted to have out there in the public. The forces of positivity came together. There was a candlelight march and a number of other, by the 1990s, and a number of other positive outcomes, probably something like the Community Coalition on Race may have coalesced behind that kind of energy. So I'll leave my comments on housing to that.
Okay, thank you. Reverend, go ahead, Reverend Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, you can call me Reverend. That's good.
I was about to.
I would just be remiss if I did not sort of jump in here. I certainly echo, and one of the things I've always loved about Pastor Richardson is that since he came to this town, he talked about the need to really document the rich history of Blacks in this community. And I'm sitting here thinking I really need to sit and write this book. One of the things I wanted to say is that, the whole history of South Orange and Blacks in South Orange is inextricably tied, to First Baptist Church. And I remember my mother and grandmother, telling stories because the house on 2nd Street was really a central meeting ground. And my mother, I remember her sharing that when she was little, the domestic workers on Thursdays, because apparently Thursday was the day that they had off, would come to the house, and they often open the house up and let people come and, you know, tend to their business, etc. So the house, 42nd Street, was, you know, really a meeting ground as well. It was close to the church, and people were able to come and just really, really thrive. But I want to highlight that going back to, especially since Dr. Pritchard raised those issues, I know I left here in the late 60s and then was away for about 20 years. But I do know that, oh, I lost my thought, sorry.
We come back to it.
Yeah,
Don't
come
worry.
back to me.
No
Yeah, I
problem.
forgot what I was going to say, you know,
Yeah,
about
no
that.
problem.
Forgive me.
No problem. Reverend David, your family was the first Black family to move to Stanley Road. So we're interested in your experience and what made your family move to Stanley Road. And let me also add a footnote, because one of the questions just asked about moving to Maplewood and being thrown down and called a nigger and graffiti being sprayed on their property. You know, did you all have any of those kind of challenges?
Well, what made us move was, first of all, there were 7 of us by then, and we were living in a 3-bedroom house in East Orange, and one of those bedrooms was a guest room. So we were all in. My father wanted to give each of us, his children, a bedroom, so that was a part of it. So my father tended to be very political and contact the people who whatever needs to happen. And First Baptist had launched a fair housing initiative. So through the fair housing initiative, what happened, and I resented it, everybody who lived on Stanley Road had to sign a petition that they would not move. I'm like, why do you want to live in a place that people, a petition had to be signed? But everything went along fine. We did have racial incidences happen, not me personally, but my brother, who in elementary school told people he was Jewish. He figured that would help his status. And my boys, when they went through South Orange school system, had problems. So I personally did not have the issue, but in my family there were experiences of discrimination.
Well, let me give you a follow-up. So do you remember when your family first moved there, did you move to, were you welcomed by the Black community that was there? Was there, in South Orange in general, not just Stanley Road, but was there a close-knit Black community?
Yes. Adney and I used to hang out.
Yeah. And you know, following the fair housing, where you had, which made it possible for others to move, you know, more easily to South Orange. Following the fair housing, back in 1970, you know, my father, Estelle's father, Reverend David's father, started the South Orange Civic Association,
Right.
which is 50 years old. And so they started that morphed into, you know, opening up. More and more people were coming to South Orange and Maplewood. Because see, when I was growing up in South Orange, and I don't know how wide this broadcast is, but the reality was that it was easier for a Black person to buy a home in Maplewood at that time than for a Jewish person to live in Maplewood, if you understand what I'm saying. And so following that, you had more and more citizens coming into South Orange and to Maplewood, and they formed SOMAC, which was the South Orange Maplewood Awareness Council, to address many of the issues that you just raised, Dr. Harris, I think Dr. Pritchard, about graffiti, name calling, and those kinds of things. They even started Harmony Days, etc. And then the South Orange Maplewood Awareness Council morphed into something else until eventually we landed with the South Orange Maplewood Coalition on Race, which is an integrated, you know, allies, you know, group, and, you know, addressing and actually being watchdogs over, who's moving where, who is being denied, being very proactive to encourage a more diverse community. And so that's why beginning in the 1970s, you began to see more of an influx of a more diverse group. And I hate using that word diverse because I always felt South Orange was very multicultural and diverse, not realizing I was the diversity, but but anyway, so I just wanted to put that little history there. And you asked, where did we come from? I know my people came from Virginia, but my mother came from South Orange, so we can track it down to Virginia, but also we're Yankees. I will say that.
Pastor Richardson, could you what was the role of First Baptist Church? You touched on it a little bit, but could you expound a little bit more? The role First Baptist Church served for the Black community, particularly new migrants to the community, and also some of the leadership of First Baptist Church, particularly Reverend Leon Sullivan.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Harris. Rich history out of me represents the different generations. I had the wonderful opportunity of knowing her mother, her father, her grandmother, and the street of 2nd Street and Church Street, long before I got there, but even when I was there, when I arrived, after I arrived, it meant so much. It was such a rich history of generation after generation after generation. So when those families did migrate from the South, a great migration, and came to South Orange, they landed right there on those streets, and it was family. It was, again, I said gymnasium, but it was also that after school supplemental education. And so it meant the world, that community, that conglomerate of individuals, they made that community, and it played an important role. Over the years, you've had so many. It's a very complicated history. In that it started in 1895 with a group of people, Black people who were worshiping in the local white church, but had to sit in the balcony. And they were in the balcony, and they were not free to really express themselves in a form of worship. And their identity was the people up in the balcony. So they formed what was known as a prayer band, about 35 of them, and they just simply came together in one of the members' homes and to have prayer. And that morphed into the First Baptist Church of South Orange years later. And so it really started with a group of people who really needed to feel community, and that's what First Baptist was. It was community for a lot of people in those days. But because of its history and some of its struggles, First Baptist experienced a lot of different pastors who came and went and was dealing with the struggles in that day and time, social, economic, political struggles. And when I came, it was a revolving door. That's what it was known as, a revolving door. But yet and still, you have some very, very dynamic and world-changing pastors who've come through the First Baptist Church of South Orange, and a very rich history. You've got Reverend Sullivan, Reverend Edgar Thomas, and so many others that made an impact in the day and time in which they served. You mentioned Leon Sullivan. Leon Sullivan, a lot of people do not know this, but Leon Sullivan, if you Google him, you'll find more about him than I can share with you tonight. Leon Sullivan came after one of the tumultuous experiences of the church in 1945 and stayed for 5 years up to 1950, and brought vision with him, brought ideas with him, and tried to implement a lot of that during that time in South Orange, but was unable to. Shared vision with First Baptist and was successful in many ways, and helped a lot of the residents, particularly the young men and women who would not have gotten into college, found a way to make sure that every single young person in that church actually got into college. And these are just stories that the residents tell me, but also Leon tells me, because Leon left First Baptist in 1950, went to Philadelphia, and the rest is just history. The vision that he tried to implement in South Orange that wouldn't take, he was able to implement in Philadelphia. And the story goes on from there. I can spend the next week sharing the impact Dr. Sullivan has had on the world. He is by far, if you read his history, he is by far one of the top contributors of the social, economic, political, and religious advancements, not just in America, but around the world. And he is someone that I feel very deeply, his story needs to be known, that he pastored this church, First Baptist, and he was a resident here in South Orange. But then you have your Edgar Thomases, who was roommate with Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King would send letters. His wife would send postcards every year. And we've had those documentations at First Baptist Church. But I do want to mention, if I can real quick, Leon came back after I arrived in 1997. He heard about this young pastor, and he came back to visit, and he adopted me personally, and I'm privileged. He adopted me personally, and he took me, and Adoni went with me also on what would be his last African summit. When he introduced his global principles to the United Nations, he took me there with him as well.
Wow.
He introduced IFISH to the world. He took me on, and I was a member of IFISH as well. So not only a rich history, not only it created community for Black families in that day and time, but even still today, we connect with all of the former pastors, all of the former members who have helped make and create a rich history for the families of color in South Orange, but also for the larger community. And we really haven't stopped since. And I'm very proud of that.
Thank you. Thank you. And as a native Philadelphian and someone who grew up in Reverend Leon Sullivan's church, the Lion from Zion, I can attest to his brilliance and brilliant pastor.
I didn't realize you were part of the church. I know you were familiar with him. I didn't realize.
Yeah, I grew up in Zion Baptist. Yeah.
Zion, okay.
Yeah, the Lion from Zion. So he
Yes,
shaped
sir.
my understanding of what a pastor should be. So,
Yeah.
but thank you. Reverend Dr. Pritchett, you are not from South Orange, but you've been in South Orange since the 1970s at Seton Hall. Can you talk about your understanding of the relationship, what you've seen in that relationship between a university and the Black community in particular of South Orange?
Certainly. Well, I might be able to comment more specifically on the relationship of Black students at Seton Hall and their relationship to South Orange, because it was, well, fascinating circumstance. You know, the folks in South Orange have a very lovely park that is between if you walk from the campus into the center of town, there's a very lovely park on the right-hand side. And so
Grove Park. It's Grove Park.
Thank you. So I guess when it comes to maintaining municipal, let's say, order, you know, it looks very functional to put a sign up that says something like, and I'm paraphrasing, a park is for local residents only. So one of the stories I would get from students is that as they're walking by the, you know, the little benches that might have been there and or stop for a moment, maybe the police car would pull up to say, hey, what are you doing? They said, well, we're just taking a little breather, officer. And he said, can't you read the sign? And he says, yeah, but we are like residents. We kind of like we are living at Seton Hall. And the policeman would say, no, that's for local residents only. So you all get up and keep on walking. But these were some of the first stories I would be getting back from students. And And I think things have changed since then, but in essence, I might say this, if I put that into a larger parcel. I worked at two other universities starting in the year 1969, and I arrived at Seton Hall 9 years later, 1978. There's something I encountered at Seton Hall with the Black students that I did not encounter in any of the other two schools. And that is, we literally, the handful of Black faculty and administrators who worked at this university, somewhere between their relations on campus and their relations with the local community, most students we met, almost half of them, did not want to stay at Seton Hall. That's the totality of the impact of the experience. So somewhere between them just walking off campus for a breather and the way they were being received in the local town, a lot of work was necessary. But we spent, that handful of faculty, we spent more time on campus in the evenings trying to put on alternative programming for the students, trying to get them to understand that their 4 years at that institution was larger than just themselves, that they had to understand the kind of struggles that earlier generations would have gone through, if not at Seton Hall, but at colleges and universities all over the country. When we think about our starting point, historically, starting point that says it's against the law to teach a Negro to read and write, but these are the stories we would tell to build capacity within those students. You know, as the years and decades rolled by, we were just so glad to even get a handful of students from the university, both Black and white, who had some interest in building better relationships. I think about one of my former students by the name of Sheena, who happened to now to be, I think, the leader of the city government, but who stepped forward in the context of representing all the interests of all students to improve what are called town and gown relations. So I shared that little story as a part of my narrative.
Yeah. You know,
Okay.
Dr. Pritchard talks about a period when I wasn't in South Orange. I left South Orange late 60s. But I think South Orange went through, like so many communities when their demographics were changing, you know, those growing pains. And so those macroaggressions and microaggressions in terms of who belongs here, who doesn't belong here, that was all a part of that transition beginning in the 1970s, when you began to have a larger influx of Black and brown, you know, people in the community. And people had to adjust, you know, to that. Yeah.
Okay, well, it's interesting. You know, the 1967 Newark Rebellion really changed Seton Hall because Black Studies Center comes after that. The MLK program comes after that. The Latino Studies Institute comes after that. So what kind of impact did the 67 rebellion, if you all recall, and I know Dr. Anderson, you said you had left already, but do you all recall what kind of impact that had on the Black community in South Orange? Dr. David, Reverend David?
Well, my family again moved in 63. Where our house is, Stanley Road, is a couple of blocks away from the city board line between Newark and South Orange. The thing that I noticed when I went to the middle school was the influx of nouveau riche people. I didn't understand that then, because I remember this girl in home ec, so it tells you the age, talking about she didn't know what she wanted for her birthday. She already had been promised a card. She had a ring, and I'm like, I'm not used to any of this stuff. So like the attitude of those who had fled Newark, they had arrived and they were big time. So that is my lived experience in terms of the influx. I didn't recognize it because I didn't know that all this was going on. So there were snobs, you know, amongst us, and they weren't the people who I hung out with.
Dr. Harris, you keep referencing the protest, the riots that took place, in Newark.
Right.
And, I remember I was still here in South Orange.
Oh, you were? Okay.
But there was, major concern because,
Those people.
when you're younger and you hear the word riot, you don't know really what that means.
Yeah.
But you do know that there's a connection, and that's South Orange Avenue. And South Orange Avenue was that throughway. And so you had a lot of businesses that were destroyed. I could certainly tell stories of people I knew who lived in South Orange, who found themselves in Newark during that time, and the difficult time that they had getting back up, South Orange, right? Getting back up South Orange Avenue.
Mhm.
But I think the riots just marked a change
Right.
across the nation. You saw the emergence of a different sense of pride. We all know the story of James Brown when he was up in Boston, and shortly after riots there, and next he pinned "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." So I only say that to say that I think that there were positive outcomes of that, even for the communities of South Orange and Maplewood. Certainly in the 70s, and if you read the history of South Orange, you have a groundswell of Black and Brown into the areas, which went into the 80s and the 90s, et cetera. And now these communities, South Orange and Maplewood, are held up as the most racially integrated, most racially diverse communities. So, I
So,
think.
it's interesting because, at Seton Hall, of course, before the 1960s, you don't have that many Black people at Seton Hall, but they start coming in trickles. So by the end of the 60s, the students are protesting. They start their own organization.
Right.
The Monsignor at the time even encouraged the students to meet with Amiri Baraka
Mhm.
in terms of working and developing a Black Studies Center. So then they get the Black Studies Center. And then even in the early 70s, Betty Shabazz is working with the center.
Mhm.
They give an honorary doctorate to Alex Haley. They give an honorary doctorate to Gil Noble, and Gil Noble is teaching at the school. So there's a vibrant Black presence. James Brown comes to the university and performs. So my question is, as that's developing, did you all see any connect to the Black community in South Orange? Or was that just
Seton Hall.
on Seton Hall's campus?
Yeah,
I would
I think
say
it was mainly,
just
I would say
Seton Hall.
mainly Seton Hall too, yeah.
Yeah.
But let me just say that I remember that I was in Boston, but I came home the summer, I think it was 1970 or 71. And my friend, who I just spoke to the other day, Dr. Crystal Kuykendall, she's probably in your records because she started the first Black Studies class and was hired as the first tenured full-time Black Studies professor at Seton Hall. And that was back in early 70s. Plus the connecting force there at Seton Hall was that they ran a rather robust, and they may even run it to today, Upward Bound program.
Mhm.
And I know that one summer that I found myself in South Orange, I worked at Seton Hall in the Upward Bound program. And there was a strong connection there because they were developing their African Studies program. They had the Upward Bound program. And so you had Black folks, and it was just a robust experience.
I would like to provide some historical context
Thank you.
to that. I graduated from high school in '67. I didn't choose to go to Seton Hall. I went to Uppsala, which was in East Orange. During the '60s, we were pushing for Black studies, Black student organizations. So it was something that was happening nationally. So it does not surprise me that these notable people were brought in to help that push. In Uppsala, we were still fighting what was the need, which was usually the first question. But I would say that Seton Hall was responding to the times. And I know people who went to Seton Hall during that time, and the whole push for Black studies and all that was coming from the student population. So that's great to hear that these notable people were invited to come to Seton Hall.
Yeah. And one other thing I would add to that, because you talked about the relationship and you're jogging my memory, because I was just in high school, but I remember my parents adopting the few Black students at Seton Hall. And they would come down to our house and have Sunday dinner with us. And I mean, I could cite some names right now because I'm still friends with them, 60 years later. But so that was in part the relationship as well. And you see that relationship today. Pastor Richardson, not to speak for you, Pastor, opens up his heart and his church always, to the Seton Hall students who come down to First Baptist, and they just do not drop in, but they become an integral part of the church community.
Yeah, and thank you, Adine. I was definitely going to say something about that, but I definitely was not around doing 67. So I was literally saying, okay, Reverend David, you do your thing, and Adine, you do your thing. But piggybacking off Adine, yes, what wonderful positive effects as well. So fast forwarding to today. Now, again, First Baptist Church has, in my opinion, the former pastors have always been community minded to a degree in South Orange. Again, we mentioned Leon. Leon is definitely a totally different story there. But fast forwarding to today, here's part of my pride of the diversity of South Orange and the fact that we've grown to this. Yes, we have had over the history of people of color in the township of South Orange. We're laying down what we know to be factual events that occurred. And I think that's what we need. But yes, First Baptist Church and its legacy has not stopped. Personally, I have partnered with, and as well as our church, so many of the community organizations. We literally give dollars and cents. We must have at least planted $1 million without exaggeration back to our community programs to help improve human conditions, as well as to be really a part of the thriving South Orange that today. Seton Hall students, we have Seton Hall students where we've opened up the doors over the last 24 years, and we've taken in students each and every year. And we've been their church away from home. And we work with their home church to make sure they carry out every assignment they're supposed to take out, they're supposed to complete while they're matriculating at Seton Hall. We built wonderful friendships with former students around the world that we continue to have engagement and relationships with today. And they often speak of the rich experiences they've had because of First Baptist Church, or First Baptist Church helped enrich their college experience. And we're very, very proud of that. And it has gone a long way for us, and it's gone a long way for individuals. Now, I will say this, however, when it comes to Seton Hall, I have lamented over my tenure here in South Orange that Seton Hall was a little bit too quiet and invisible when it comes to being one of the largest institutions in South Orange, a little quiet when it comes to helping or participating or at least showing some concerns with some of the issues that South Orange face. So what I've done is myself partner with individuals in Seton Hall, building a wonderful relationship with people like Dr. Pridgett, being so thankful to the former provost who reached out to the community, not just locally, but in the neighboring communities, East Orange, Orange, and Newark, to talk about how Seton Hall can play a role in students who were headed to historical Black colleges. That's of recent. So I'm glad to hear of the recent activities, but we've always been from a mindset, even though we are, First Baptist is historically the only predominantly African-American church in South Orange, its history, we are proud to also boast that today we are more diverse than we've ever been, because it's important for me to not only keep the legacy going and have it known of the legacy, the rich history of First Baptist and the role it played in some of the earlier Black families, but also today how we are embracing to make sure that the idea that we look like the community, that First Baptist Church represents the diversity of the community. And I try to do everything that I can do to make sure everybody feels welcome, but at the same time, encourage our community organizations like Seton Hall to do the same, to embrace the diversity that not only that we have in our community as a whole, but to embrace diversity within our own organizations. And we will need to do that because it adds to the rich history of who we are as a town.
I'm curious, as somebody who, you know, I've only been in this area for 2 years now, going on 2 years. How would you all describe the flavor of South Orange, the Black community in South Orange? So you're a community that is known for attracting Black artists, including Thelonious Monk. Black people moved there during the 1980s, but it's decreasing in the past 10 years. So how would you describe the flavor of Black culture in South Orange, the Black history in South Orange?
I think South Orange has attracted a lot of artists. Mtume is here, and there are others, but there's also a white community of artists that are here. So there's a richness and a diversity that exists here that attracts people to this town. I remember years and years ago, there used to be a downtown art festival. They would have noted artists and their works post their works, and things like that appeal to people who are in that arena. So I think that what happens in South Orange attracts other people of the same kind here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think when we first opened our conversation, if we look back to the early days, you know, our world was divided between Black and white, you know, and then now we have major immigration, et cetera. So now it's Black and brown and all. And but I know when I was growing up, it was either Black and white. But now it is, you know, very brown. And I think South Orange has kept up with the sign of the times. And to Pastor's point about the rich diversity of the church, you know, when I think of diversity, and that's why I'm often stumped when people say, well, tell me about the diversity of South Orange. You know, the least of which to me is the ethnic and racial diversity. That's the obvious. But the diversity of ideas, the diversity of cultures, the diversity of creativity. I mean, I think in today's time, those are the things that attract people to an area, you know, such as South Orange. It's proximity to Newark. It's amazing. The amazing things going on in Newark. The Newark Museum, I mean, I know there's NJ Pack, but the Newark Museum has a rich legacy and history. So that, you know, proximity there just makes, I think, South Orange very attractive as well. And certainly it's proximity to, you know, to New York. But there are hurdles. And I mean, I think there are hurdles because we live in a society that is founded on the transatlantic caste, you know, system. You know, we're still dealing with institutional and structural racism. So I think it's the sign of the times, but I think that there's the opportunity and the access to begin to make an inroad here in South Orange.
Yeah, and I can't personally speak to the fact that in the last census, it shows that a lot of Black families are moving out of South Orange. But, you know, one of the issues that first issues that I tackled in partnership with Dr. Werner was from the Civic Association was the challenge with the leveling in the high school. And that had gone on for years and years. And I've worked with different superintendents. I've worked with the different principals from Columbia High School, as well as the student body, to try to really face and tackle this issue and really have an opportunity to have the young people voice what their concerns are. So to Adeni's point, yes, there are still some concerns. It is not a perfect community. I must at least boast about the fact that given the work of some of the organizations in town, like the Community Coalition on Race, the continued effort of the Civic Association, that we are diverse. We are diverse, we embrace diversity. In some places we say it and it's not really accurate, but I boast the fact that we have Summer Jones, who is a trustee, that even our village president is in many ways, right, considered a minority. And so while we still face challenges, I'm hopeful. I'm proud to say that the diversity that Adeni speaks of, not just ethnically, but the artistry and the talent, the age, that's something to be proud of. But at the same time, we have not, in my opinion, truly arrived as the model, you would say, for America and how towns across the United States of America should take our lead. But we do offer a lot that others, I believe, can learn from. And it's
Okay, this will be the last
hat on and say you're proud of.
This will be the last question before we turn it over to the audience, and then let them ask questions. So do this quickly. We're just going to go boom boom on this question. So what are some of the names of the Black businesses that were important in the Black community in South Orange, and also some of the names of the Black families that are stalwarts in South Orange?
Slackman family.
Right. So you want to go back?
And,
You want to go back to like the 1900s?
Wherever you want to take it back to.
Slackman family shares, as well as Dorothy Pons, Alice Lewis, rich history and stick-to-itiveness and stability and pride.
You have other names like the Baileys, the Dawsons, the Whites, the Clarks. I know Mr. Clark, for example, had a moving business. You had the Askews, who had a cleaners. You had the Romans, who were great football players at Columbia High School. And also one became a dentist and had a business. You had quite a few, I know my own grandfather had a limousine business. You had taxi businesses, you had the Barnes, you had the Hendersons, you had the Scotts. So again, through the lens, through a child's heart, as Stevie Wonder would say, and I was that child, the lived experience was that of opportunity and access. But it did not come without its problems. But we also had parents, or I had parents, who put racism in perspective, who gave me a strong sense of self-esteem, who noticed when I was in primary school, elementary school. Now, when I look back, I see the class was very diverse. When I got to junior high and high school, I was the single Black in that classroom. And I say single Black, not only Black, because I didn't feel like the only one. I was never allowed to feel othered, and nor would I allow others to ever make me feel othered. So that was a part of the strong family legacy that I spoke of earlier from my immediate and also my extended, family. And the perspective was that if you were not welcome, it was their issue, not yours, so.
And I would say some of the more recent families that moved to South Orange, recent is probably like, probably not the right word, but the Mtumes, the Monks, the
although they've been here a while now too, except Reverend David, you and I've been here a long time. I remember when you moved, to the area.
I know you do.
Yep, and we became fast friends.
Yes, we did. The Yambas, the Staggers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm having a senior moment, so I'm gonna stop.
Yeah. There was also a store. You had the Brocks, who had a candy store right next there on, what is that, Valley Street, right next to the church.
Yep.
So Yeah, so folks were very industrial and
Mhm.
enterprising.
Thank you.
Before we turn it over to questions, I'm just going to throw a shameless plug out here. Reverend David, you actually mentioned we had an artist event in the past. We actually, as part of Black History Month this month, we are going to have an art exhibit. We have 18 pieces of artwork that is going to be displayed in near the Duck Pond Meadowland Park.
Really?
We have had issues with snow, and so there has been a delay with putting stakes into the ground. Oh my God, and it's supposed to snow on Friday too. And then the other thing that I think is the one person that wasn't mentioned here was Lee Boswell May, who was also one of the family. Her family was here again when I go, and I went back to the census at any, so it was me. And so when I look back, you know, her family had been here for a number of years and she had a lot of really great stories. We are naming a street after her between Meade Street and South Orange Avenue, and that will also happen this month. And so I think that it's a great opportunity to ensure that, again, a lot of the stories from South Orange is captured. Because when I look back at some of the information that is captured, you know, it's really good, but it needs to get out there, and I think it needs to be really talked about.
Yeah.
So we are gonna
just say one more thing. I mean, if you look around South Orange now, you have myriad businesses for hair and nails, etc. But one of the leaders that set the foundation was Demetrius on South Orange Avenue. That set the precedent, you know, for all of the, you know, hair salons that you see throughout the community now.
Yeah. So we are going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, you can either put it in the Q&A and we can read it, or you can raise your hand on the Zoom. You can raise hand and then we can open it up so you can actually ask the question directly.
Not too hard.
Yeah. So I guess just to go through some of the questions that are currently in the Q&A, Reverend Davis, this was for you. This is from one of your, I'm sorry, Reverend David, I was reading it as is. Reverend David, this is for you. One of the things that you mentioned is there were some glitches that you believe the village should still address. What are those? What are those?
Well, I don't know if you remember 2 years ago, there was a teacher that had a slave market going on in the school. And there was an uproar, but it also demonstrates the lack of sensitivity in understanding what is oppressive history and what is rich history. So I would say within the school system, there needs to be an upgrade of the leaders through the teachers, the superintendents, the administrators in those schools in terms of being more compassionate in understanding our history and what's not a good thing to be teaching or promoting. I know that the police force has gotten better, but there were many glitches within that police force. Those people that were stopping your students were probably the police. Mm-hmm. And I don't know the status or the relationship the police have now in terms of Black and brown people in South Orange, because I personally have not experienced anything, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening. I know that a couple of years ago, in that little newspaper thing, there was a whole issue about homeless people in the train station. Well, we need to come up with how we're going to address these issues in a humane way and not just kick people out and call them bad names or whatever, because these social problems are real in America, and we have not addressed them very well.
You know, I'm glad that you raised the issue of the schools. I wasn't going to go there. But since I'm representing quote unquote 5 generations here, you know, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And I know that what always, a little anecdotal story that I'd always tell when I would come here and encounter new people who had moved here and who would boast, oh, I've been in South Orange 11 years. I've been here, you know, 15 years, you know, and I would just sit there, just wait and wait and wait. And then they ask, and how long have you been here? And I'm like, I've been here, you know, forever. But they would have the same concerns about their children in the schools that I remembered floating around when I was coming up, that my parents had, you know, in dealing with my brother. And the same stories that my mother could tell when she and her siblings graduated from Columbia High School in 1935, 38, 30, 40, in 1940. And the same issues were still there. And so I echo that there's always that sense of just how well, you know, South Orange has or has not, South Orange or Maplewood, addressed the issue of equity and diversity and inclusion in the real sense within the schools. And I know we have great organizations like the South Orange Maplewood Coalition, Community Coalition, who continues to be the watchdog, you know, and to monitor that. But, you know, at some point, I would expect a different result.
Yeah, and go ahead.
I just wanted to add, just to address Reverend David, to let you know what the town is doing. Based on the newspaper article that came out and the history of police, we did create a community police collaborative. We are meeting once a month. We do try to go through what we can do to kind of create a collaboration between the police and the community. And as you guys know, when you look nationally, it's hard, right? Because we all have our opinions on policing, but we have been working really hard to try to create some sort of relationship. We are also under Trustee Collier, Donna Collier, we are actually putting together, and we're working with Seton Hall, a care and community justice group, which is it's a social worker program, or similar to a social worker program, to figure out ways that we can stop the police from being the first person going out. So it would address some of the homeless situation. It would address some of the IEP people, as well as other issues that are happening in town. And so we're trying very hard to make some sort of change and some sort of dent to change. I actually did go to Seton Hall, and when I went to Seton Hall, I was pulled over by, not pulled over, I was walking, and I did get pulled over by 2 police officers. So, you know, everyone has different experiences in the town, and those common experiences are the ones that we're trying to really fix and really try to resolve. Reverend Richardson, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, just to this point real quick, listen, I agree with Reverend David. So we've come far, again, just laying down the history. And that was, at least I was excited to be a part of this panel, to lay down a history and to really educate people about the first Black families and the footprint that it has on South Orange. So while we've come a great way, and while there's diversity in terms of talents and skills and even race, listen, there are still a lot of issues, whether it's in the high school and leveling, racial tension that's also in the high school, not enough people of color represented in the governmental positions and offices in town. But here's the thing I think that has been ongoing in the 24 years I've been here, where we do mention words like equality or integration or other words, it's only in word and it's not really in reality, you know. So acceptance, and we're still working on true acceptance for based on how the color of a person's skin, based on their gender and so on and so forth. So inclusion is not true inclusion. And that's been my true experience for 24 years. We'll talk inclusion, we'll sit around and have conversations about race and things like that. That's wonderful, that's great. But in my opinion, there's not, people who move into this community have not truly embraced the true definitions of inclusion, equality, and in some cases, justice on political levels, the social level, as well as economic levels. And when we look at what we're doing now, we're doing a master plan. So I can go into a lot of things, but I just really want to point out to us, we've come a long ways, but we still have a long way to go when it really comes to inclusion and equality.
So one of the questions in the Q&A, it's really a two-parter, and Adani, I was wondering maybe you might be able to answer it since your family, when you look at everyone, hopefully. So Reverend Richardson mentioned that people who worked for white families and eventually, I'm sorry, the Q&A is jumping, and so, and eventually lived in town. Many larger homes had living quarters for household employees. Was there a community of those people before some became homeowners themselves? And again, I know you were not alive because you were, but do you know if your family had experience meeting people that lived, I guess, in the other homes and then before they bought their homes?
Well, I mean, I can speculate and say I'm sure. I mean, that was the makeup of of South Orange and Maplewood. You had homeowners, you had African Americans who lived and worked there, just as you had Jews and Italians, etc. During that time, if you keep in mind, the societal structure was that you had the male who went out to work and the female stayed home. I mean, and that was a sign of the times. Mm-hmm. And so in those homes, you had domestics and people could afford them. People who moved to South Orange and Maplewood now are dual career. They need both incomes to purchase a home. But back then, when I was growing up, even my mother was a stay-at-home mom. I mean, she was the PTA president, one of the first, Black presidents of the PTA. But it was, again, a sign of the times. But again, you had domestics who did work and I'm sure lived, in the homes. And I'm sure as they advanced in life, that they, perhaps decided to settle in South Orange and may have settled, in South Orange. I can only speculate that. Because keep in mind what people did for their day job and then how they may have appeared. And I know the Black church especially has a long history with this, just in terms of Black liberation theology, that the Black church was a place where many Black people could feel, a sense of productivity, a sense of esteem, because they were beaten down in other areas of society, but in the Black church, they held positions of authority. I know I used to be so mesmerized by the deacons in the church because I thought they were bigger than life. As I got older, I realized and learned what they may have done in life, their day job. But again, the Black church provided that haven, for that. So to answer your question, I can only speculate, but I'm sure just as many of us came to South Orange and loved South Orange, you settled in South Orange. You liked it. Does that help? Summer, did I answer that?
It was someone else's question, so I'm going to hope that it helps them. I'm going to move on to the next question. I just wanted to clarify, just for the record, I was not pulled over as a trustee. I was a student. I was in my 20s. I was walking with a computer because I was teaching computers and, there weren't laptops. I was literally walking with a whole huge computer. So Dr. Anderson and Reverend David both mentioned the Jewish community. How was the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community in South Orange? How has the relationship changed over the years?
I would say it ebbs and flows. When my father was alive, he had rabbis and people he was working with, and then it flows. There's non-existent. Reverend Richardson is probably better able to address that in terms of a faith community, in terms of the leaders within that. But at this point, I can speak to one point in history, but I can't speak to present.
Okay.
So to add to that, I am definitely aware in the history and the chronicles of First Baptist Church that there were relationships between First Baptist Church and the Jewish synagogues where they would swap pulpits, if you will. Fast forwarding it to today, there's a rich relationship between several of the synagogues. It's not all of the synagogues in South Orange and First Baptist Church, but it also goes and extends beyond the borders of South Orange, where we have relationships with synagogues in multiple towns. And then to Reverend David's comment, those relationships, many of them were first forged in the relationship between clergy in town, which made up the South Orange Maplewood Clergy Association. But we've gone as far as to create additional relationships and foster and build different relationships out with Jewish community outside of South Orange. And that still holds true today.
I wanted to ask Dr. Harris, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know you were moderating, but however, you are the chair of Africana Studies at Seton Hall. From a student perspective, what do you do on campus to ensure that the students feel welcome and involved? And how are you utilizing your program to create discussion and change?
Oh, that's a very good question. Dr. Pritchett probably could answer it better than I can in terms of the first part, in terms of the programs for welcoming students, freshman programs. Because I know he works a lot with the freshmen, with the MLK Scholars Program. But this semester we're doing something very unique. We have a Model Gary Convention, which is based on the 1972 National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana, which Amiri Baraka co-chaired. And it was a very important convention for developing the concept of a Black agenda. And so we have our students now in 6 different committees addressing current issues, be it healthcare, criminal justice, education, politics, arts and entertainment, and economic development. So in that way, we're really trying to engage our students to really not only learn the past, but apply what they're learning to current issues. And that's something that we try to do in our classes as well.
I can add something I'll just mention as a note. Back in an earlier period of time when things were difficult, both on campus and in the local community, the Black Studies Center, periodically would hold like a fellowship hour for all the students on the campus, particularly the African American students, to come over to hang out with faculty. We would have jazz music playing, have some refreshments, but we made our spaces safe spaces for them, but we also made it feel like home and a little bit of the Black church vibe, so that everybody would, in a sense, just appreciate the fact that we were all family together. So I think for many decades or generations of students, that sense of community was what pulled many of the students back into the university, particularly after they had a desire to leave. So I thought I would add that footnote to that.
And then the last question is, in the 70s and 80s, there was an uptick of people that moved to South Orange at one point. When you look at the demographics, South Orange had gotten to 32%, almost 32% Black, right? Black community. What drove the change in the 70s and 80s? Can someone, I don't know if anyone can answer that. What was the change? Why were more people from the Black outside of South Orange coming into the community.
Housing was more available to them. There was a point after the rebellion in Newark that I forgot what they called it, that they would sell a house in one block and then scare everybody else off the block so they could sell those houses as well. So that practice went on for a few years, but the opportunity to move was not available before that. So what ended up happening over time, there was a stabilization that began to happen in the neighborhoods. And, you know, people move where they know that they would be welcome.
I would agree with that. You know, there was the availability. Can you hear me okay? I know my mic was chopping up everything. So that's the draw between, do I wear a necklace or do I wear my mic? So
Always the necklace, always the necklace.
That's what I say too. But yeah, I mean, and laws opened up. There was more, you know, protection. Plus, you know, we had this generation, the baby boomers, who moved into well-paying jobs, and so the money was available as well. And even when you look in South Orange and Maplewood now, I mentioned that it takes, you know, a dual career to be able to afford the housing. And interestingly enough, which is not surprising, you know, Blacks usually make so much more who are buying the same level of house of somebody white for whom the house or income may be less. So, and I just think that there's a wave in society as well. It's interesting that more Black and brown people are leaving South Orange. I think that we're beginning to see a reverse migration back to the South after the tremendous great, you know, migration up here, you know, to the North. Many are moving back to the South for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which is taxes. But you know, I just think that that's and you know, people have more opportunity and access, et cetera.
Right.
But we also want to note that what was happening on the national scene was also happening on the local scene. So when we talk about the 70s and the 80s, we're talking about civil rights. And during that period of time, at least I know in South Orange, and as my colleagues mentioned about housing and how housing just simply opened up due to white flight, a lot of that caused by realtors and that scare tactic. But you also had individuals at that time, Dr. Thomas, who was pastoring First Baptist at that time. And again, he's a former roommate in college at Morehouse with Dr. Martin Luther King. And so he also, Dr. Thomas, or Reverend Thomas, also spearheaded a lot of civil rights initiatives in South Orange and around the area of South Orange, actually being the president of the South of the Oranges and Maplewood NAACP. Fair housing came, right? It's kind of birthed out of that period with Edgar Thomas. So what's happening on the national scene in terms of civil rights movement and so on and so forth was also happening on the local scene as well. And I think that may also, at least we need to take in consideration that may have also attracted a lot of and opened up the situation where a lot of Blacks would migrate to South Orange and Maplewood.
I remember in high school the First Baptist had voter registration, you know, and that was a Freedom Summer. And many went down from First Baptist. And also we opened the doors at First Baptist to facilitate that. And there were students from out of state, you know, who came and set up booths at First Baptist to be able to encourage voter registration, even here, you know, in South Orange.
So this discussion of South Orange and the Black community can probably go on all night. And I know that there are some more questions in the chat, but I wanted to give you guys one last opportunity if you wanted to speak on just your overall experience of South Orange and, you know, what you hope that future generations will get from either going to school at Seton Hall or from living in the community. So I'll start with Dr. Pritchett first.
Well, I think the best is yet to come. I survived the 20th century working at Seton Hall and being as best a partner as I could with South Orange community, but I'm extremely optimistic about what we are laying the foundation for right now in the 21st century. Great optimism and great partnerships. And I think the foundation has been laid. So let us all continue to communicate and work together for that better future. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Harris.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for allowing me to moderate the discussion.
Thank you for doing it.
Yeah, I just think I'm looking forward to strengthening the relationship between Seton Hall and South Orange community, particularly the Black community in South Orange.
Reverend David. I'm going around like a U based on my squares.
I always am an advocate of a beloved community where people have mutual respect, have mutual justice, and we don't have to love each other, but we got to get along at least. And I always hold that model in my head. It's biblical. Dr. King advocated it, and I continue to advocate that as being the ideal situation, not only for South Orange, but for America.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson.
Sure. So I always go to Luke, you know, to whom much is given, much is required. And I think that growing up in South Orange, living in South Orange, that one, you know, I had a unique opportunity, and it's important to turnkey it and to, you know, to give it back. And I think that that's part of the legacy of 5 generations living here in South Orange. I think certainly there's room for improvement. I hope that there's always, you know, dialogue and conversation, but I also hope that these communities will actually walk the talk, you know, and focus on, you know, diversity and equity and access, you know, in the real sense, and to realize that, you know, this is all of our, you know, community. And I think there's right opportunity here, but I do know that there's work that needs to be done to undo many of the historical legacies that exist in this community and a lot of communities. But I'm hopeful, and I just think that if we continue to have people like you, Trustee Jones, who are willing to be proactive and to convene gatherings like this, I think it begins with understanding, it begins with awareness, and it begins with this mutual exchange. So I thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Richardson.
Yeah, first, I think it begins with us acknowledging the fears we live with, the biases we live with. Because for me, it's authenticity, it's being authentic in ourselves, and it's being honest with ourselves. And I think we can move forward with optimism, but only if we're honest with ourselves, that we've made mistakes in the past. Our country has made mistakes. I'm not saying going back and living and owning them, but I'm saying being truthful and honest with ourselves. That a foundation has been laid that's kind of divided us. And if we're going to be true to what we boast to be, a community of inclusion, then we cannot be afraid to talk about the pains of the past and the reality that some of those biases and fear has caused today. So to be authentic and our authentic selves as a community of inclusion, we can't fear conversations. We fear our true feelings that, sometimes I don't know how to talk to somebody outside my own socioeconomic and political arena. But to say, hey, but it's okay to open up a dialogue and to talk. So I think fear of those hidden emotions, those things those emotions that are really beneath what we portray or we promote to be. And until we really tap into those things and open up and have a dialogue, then I think we're bound to repeat or hold on to a status quo. Let's learn something from this generation today. This generation that speaks up and speaks out, these young adults, say it's not really right and it's wrong. Ethically, it's wrong religiously, it's wrong morally to just simply go around hating.
Right.
Are we going to hold on to a past thought pattern? Are we going to hold on to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, 200 years ago? And we're either going to hold on to that and demand that we teach that to the generation and that they hold on to our failures, our pains, or our inconsistencies of the past, or we're going to open up and listen to them because they speak and are speaking loudly to us. And so I just think I agree with the optimism, but I think we really need to be true to some of those hidden biases and really open up a dialogue to say, how can I learn? I want to learn, and I want to, for the sake of our community and being what we portray ourselves to be. And that I can sit at the lunch counter with Summer, or I can sit at the lunch counter with Donna. I can sit on the board, and it doesn't matter whether you're from up the hill in South Orange or you're down there by, I don't know,
You're gonna name my street, aren't you? You're gonna name my street because I'm right on the edge.
Grove Park. We're one community. And until we really say that's who we are and want to be, I'm afraid we're going to continue to struggle. But I do have optimism. Listen to the young people.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to the young people.
So I want to thank you all tonight. Again, we're in the middle of Black History Month. South Orange has a really great Black History program going on this month. This conversation is not over. Again, we are truly trying to create a way for people in the community to share their stories and for them to live on. Seton Hall also, just as for the community, Seton Hall has a really great program as well, and a lot of those programs are open to the community. I was just on the Boondocks, the history of the Boondocks, yesterday with Seton Hall, but there's a lot of really great programming coming out of both Seton Hall University as well as South Orange. But this is not, again, this is not the end of this conversation. I still have 2 more years as a trustee, and so I really want to, I want to make sure that we are moving in the right direction. And so I want to, again, thank you guys for, Dr. Anderson, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I had a chance to glance in the chat, and
Yep.
I'm a career principal, been a principal for 32 years, and so children are at the heart of what I do. And so there's one question here about what advice would we give for growing up strong and proud in South Orange. And so I'm not going to take the time now, but if anyone needs to get in contact with me, please feel free to give them my contact information, because I would love to talk about how it is that you can grow up and what we need to do to arm our children to grow up and have this high sense of self-esteem in a place like South Orange. I just needed to say that because I'm moved by.
I did see it, yeah. For anyone that did leave a question, I'm going to make sure that it does get back to the panel. I just wanted to be cognizant of the time because there are some comments and questions about, the businesses, and I want to make sure all of them get answered. So my goal is to make sure that you guys get some of the questions out there. All right. So is there anything else that anyone wanted to add? I wanted to thank our attendees. Again, this is recorded. It will be posted in the next couple days to the South Orange website so that we can share it with people that could not attend. But I do, again, want to thank you guys. This is not the end of this conversation, and we will continue. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Good night, South Orange.
Great job.
Others.
Thanks, Summer.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Did a great job.
Yes,
Thank you.
And thank you, Reverend Harris. Nice job.
God bless you all.
You guys are rock stars, man.